Hello, Luke. Can you tell me your own involvement in marriage equality here in Australia, please?
Certainly. In 2004, very early on in the year, we set up Australian Marriage Equality. It was a small, I guess you'd call it a collective, probably around 10 people. I'm not exactly sure of the right number. And it started as a phone teleconference of different interested people around the country, which Rodney Karoon brought together. And at that early meeting, Geraldine Donahue from Brisbane and myself, who at the time was from Sydney, were elected the first conveners or spokespeople for Australian Marriage Equality.
And this was before the Marriage Act was amended by John Howard, wasn't it?
That's right. I think there's some confusion there that we kind of were reacting to the legislation. In fact, we preempted it. And we weren't really exactly sure that that legislation was coming, but we thought something might be happening. And it was really because we set up ourselves to support the couples that were returning from overseas, particularly British Columbia, who were wanting to then go through the courts and have their marriage recognised.
But for you, why was marriage equality so important at the time?
Yeah, I would say at the time it would be connected to my religious upbringing. And at the time I was still quite religious, and the connection between that part of my life and marriage was quite important. And I wanted to have the same sort of celebration of my relationship to my partner that my sister had had, for example.
And you did get married, didn't you? But not here in Australia.
No, we went to Vancouver, Canada, and we were married on top of Grouse Mountain, looking out over the city. And we had a United Church of Canada wedding, so we went through the normal church counselling process beforehand. And we had our family from Australia come over for the wedding, and our Baptist minister from Australia, well, my parents' Baptist minister, came over for the wedding as well.
And you were the youngest Australian citizen at the time to get married?
We were, apparently. It was something I think we sort of became aware of at the time. A journalist or someone mentioned it to us, that as far as they could see, we were the youngest, definitely.
Was there a reaction in the media to your marriage?
Yeah, it got a bit of attention. I think we didn't expect it. I don't know what we thought when we set up AME, but I didn't expect that people were going to be that interested in that side. And funny enough, I think we put out press releases about marriage equality, but the media really didn't pick it up in those days very much at all. Even the queer press sort of didn't as much. But as soon as they had a face, like a couple who were getting married and then actual wedding photos, they really latched onto it. In fact, the photo they used of me for the longest time, they kept asking me, they wanted some sort of photo in a tux. And it ended up being the photo of me in my sister's wedding party, which they ended up using for a long time.
Did you feel you became the poster boy for marriage equality advocates?
I hate that term. But I guess, yeah, although in those days I wouldn't really have called it a poster boy, because that sort of has a positive connotation. Because I think in those days it wasn't really necessarily something you want to walk down Oxford Street being the person talking about marriage equality, because people would come up to you in the street from the gay nightclubs in those days and tell you how much they hated what you're doing. So it is it's amazing to see what it's like today. In fact, it's kind of, I guess with a heavy heart, I'm kind of jealous of the movement today, in that I think it's a much more exciting time to be involved, and a much more, hopefully there's more positive reinforcement than what we got in those early days.
You talked about the hostile comments that you got back then. What kind of comments were they?
Yeah, look, a lot of groups, and I don't really want to be too specific because they're very, very positive today. And it's worth remembering that they've gone through a big change. And really in 2004, what we were sort of, in a way, throwing on the LGBTI community was quite radical, in a weird way. It was radical. So they had a bit of a journey to go on. But yeah, the people were quite hostile. They didn't like the idea. It was sort of a lot of the gay lib stuff. But also, I think at the time, if we put it in context, say New South Wales had only just got equal age of consent. Tasmania had less than 10 years of decriminalisation. So there were some people predominantly in Sydney, where I was sort of living at the time, who sort of thought it was too soon. They were saying, there's other things we need to do first, like parenting rights, which of course wasn't recognised at the time, and also de facto, which we didn't even have federally.
Did this frustrate you?
Sorry?
Did it frustrate you, the comments you got?
Yeah, really frustrated. Because I think at the time my attitude was, well, if you don't want it, you don't have to worry about it. I didn't realise, the argument today more from people like that is that it eats up the airtime of other issues. But if anything, I'd probably argue that it has actually raised awareness of other issues. And I would have to say that that would be why we got de facto recognition in 2008. And it was a direct consequence of asking for things like marriage. It's sort of I guess a bit of a guilt thing from the Labor Party government at the time, who felt bad about what had happened in the past.
You were both the youngest Australian citizens at the time to get married. Were you one of the first as well? You would have been one of the earlier ones.
Very early. There are some people that I've heard that went off, got married, came back and told no one. It just happened. And we probably don't even know who they are today because they're just happy living their lives. But I believe we were quite early, and I think you can actually get stats on that from the British Columbian government. But yeah, we definitely were quite early. We got married still when the marriage certificate and license still said husband and wife, and you had to put down in who would be the bride and who would be the groom.
Did you find attitudes in Canada and Australia were very different to your marriage?
Yeah, look, in Canada it was quite normal, and that was even very early on because that was in 2005, September 2005. So marriage had just become federal right across Canada at that point. And so it was fairly new. We went to, for example, Alberta in Canada, and I remember people weren't still very, the non-LGBTI community weren't very keen on the idea at that point, because that was one of the provinces that had held out and kind of had the federal government make them do it. But compared to Australia at the time, they were definitely much more ahead of the game on that one.
Your marriage didn't last long though, did it?
No. We'd been together 5 years, not that I think length, I wouldn't argue that length is necessarily important, because all relationships in my mind, regardless of length, have validity. But we had been together probably a few months before things went pretty bad, and we separated. We got married in the September, and I would say we separated around the end of January at that point.
That's
of the
pretty
next year.
quick.
Very quick, yeah.
So you got separated. What about a divorce?
Yes, well, at that time, foreigners couldn't get divorced in Canada. They hadn't changed the Divorce Act. And someone had already there had been a Canadian divorce because they had to go through the courts. And it was one of the very first Canadian couples who got marriage equality in Canada who had just got divorced. And when they changed the Marriage Act, they forgot to change the divorce legislation at the time, apparently. So that was now legal, but we had to go and apply. And when I went to apply, they explained that you could only have it if you had a particular visa type and residency. So my now ex applied for residency in Canada, and I, even though I was the separated spouse, was then listed on that, and then we applied for the divorce.
So you got divorced.
Yep.
You'd already been married, of course. What was the reaction like back in Australia?
Yeah, well, it didn't go down well. In fact, even in America, it didn't go down well with our friends in the US, which was just south of the border. I had one person in the US send me a 10-page written letter. Email was around, but people still wrote letters. 10-page written letter telling me all the reasons why we should stay together, and really none of the reasons were about us, which was interesting. It was all about the community, all about the cause, and we did have we lost friends in Australia. But that's kind of normal for most divorces, in that people often don't know if they're friends with both of you, which generally in particularly gay male relationships, you have mutual friends, and they then don't know what to do. They don't know what side to take. And not that they need to, but yeah, so people drifted off, but also people actively told us off, and there was even one experience, I believe, where a female friend of mine went up to my mum in a public place and told her how angry she was about me getting divorced.
So you lost quite a few friendships.
Yeah, I would say that, definitely. And actually, funny enough, it made it quite difficult dating. It would not be the first thing that you tell someone, but in this day and age where people start Googling you, and as you said, that sort of the face of marriage equality, people would quickly find out. And there was a DNA magazine article on our marriage at one point, and I remember being on a date and seeing that particular edition, even though it was several years after, sitting on the coffee table at the person's house, and I was totally freaking out that they might pick it up and find a wedding photo of me in there.
Have any of those people in the intervening years apologised to you?
No, I think a few people in their own way have suggested, that maybe they were a bit harsh. But look, I sort of thought the stigma attached to gay divorce had gone until early this year, where someone at a function stood up and told everyone that I had destroyed the sanctity of not just marriage, but same-sex marriage. Which at the time I kind of laughed, but then stopped because no one at the table defended me and everyone looked at the ground. Funny enough, it's heterosexual people who I think have turned around and said, well, what are you going on about? And they've actually, to them it's no big deal. But it's more our own community, I think, that are trying to, understandably, they're nervous. They don't want anything to rock the boat a bit.
Has your view of marriage and marriage equality changed in those years since?
I think it has, but in a different way, and probably not related to the divorce. Look, I was devastated by the divorce because of that religious upbringing. That has changed. But my view on marriage equality is still just as strong. I think that it's very important. We do still need it. That hasn't changed at all. I think my attitude now about the marriage campaigns, and even some of the early ones that I was behind and involved in, I'd probably now sort of question, in that I think it stigmatises, probably not intentionally, I don't think people go out of their way to stigmatise, but I think it stigmatises a lot of non-traditional, for want of a better word, relationships. We ignore the diversity, not just in our own community, but in the wider non-LGBTI community, of things like polyamory, or even people who want to live on their own, or people who want to marry after 3 weeks, because you often hear people talking about long-term couple want to get married. And we also prioritise people with, happy families and children that we show in photos. And we rarely ever talk about things like same-sex domestic violence, and it's actually been quite absent from the recent domestic violence discussions.
So do you think a lot of issues have been overshadowed then by the marriage equality debate?
Yeah, I think so. And again, I don't think it's out of malice, I think. And a lot of it's strategic too. You don't want to be going around promoting negative things necessarily, although, as I've said, I don't think divorce is necessarily negative, and I think we need to reframe divorce, if anything. A heterosexual female academic, a colleague of mine, just recently said that she thinks, if anything, out of this movement, it means that we need to reframe divorce for everyone, because there's still a stigma attached to it for a lot of heterosexual couples. Once
we do achieve marriage equality, what other core LGBTQI issues are there to fight for?
Yeah, lots. I was saying this the other day at the Homo Histories conference, that we still have high levels of LGBTI young people living in poverty or homeless. Early studies in Canada, the US, and now some data in Australia have showed that we have higher rates of teen pregnancy amongst same-sex attracted females and males. Which is something quite different. They're things we sort of have to actually focus on. Domestic violence, also education, working with people like police and authorities in training them about the laws, who often don't know the laws. I think working on things like that. But also, largely, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on trans issues, particularly the issue in some states of forced trans divorce, whereby transgender people have to be legally single at the time of getting a legal transition and change of birth certificate.
You were one of the founders of Australian Marriage Equality. How do you find their tactics now?
It's very different. In fact, even though we have the same name, and it's someone said to me the other day, it's like you gave up a baby for adoption and you don't like how it turned out. And that's kind of a funny way to say it, but it's just a very different movement. We, in the early days, were really focused on lobbying our own community. We were focused on lobbying those already people who support LGBTI equality to get them to agree that marriage was an issue of equality. So it's a very different idea. There was different tactics then. And also we largely were doing it, on the smell of an oily rag, There was no donations, no wide support. Sometimes it makes me laugh when you hear some organisations saying they've supported marriage equality since day one, and I'm thinking, well, I don't remember seeing anyone jumping out of their, skins to help us in 2004. In those days, it was largely the Australian Democrats and the Greens, who were very early supporters, and a couple of Labor MPs, but not too many.
Why do you think parties such as the ALP and the Liberals have been so slow to come on board?
Look, I think it's about electoral results. Funny enough, there's no real excuse now, although now that the polls have shown that majority of Australians support it, we are seeing that huge change in the Labor Party. And a lot of people in the Labor Party who are sort of champions of marriage equality now were quite angry about the movement in the early days because there was a threat that they might lose their seat. I mean, we did see that sort of happen in the seat of Melbourne in the end. I remember going to a rally in Melbourne before that election, before Adam Bandt won, and the Labor candidate stood up and the crowd booed them off the stage, and Adam Bandt got up and everyone just cheered, and you knew immediately that he was going to win that seat, and that was a marriage equality issue completely. And I think so other Labor members in CBDCs, who now are very strongly supportive of marriage equality, were quite scared and against it in those days because they saw it as a big threat to them.
Obviously what's happened, or arguably what's happened in Ireland and recently in the United States and other countries has provided momentum. How do you feel about what's happened there?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That's part of that tactics that I disagree with. I get very upset when I hear the framing of our lives as second-class citizens. I don't believe we're second-class citizens. I don't believe not being able to have the choice of marriage makes you a second-class citizen. There are more important things that can, like I was saying, poverty and homelessness and things like that. But I don't think marriage is necessarily that litmus test for being a second-class citizen. And it also creates a very negative environment for young people to grow up. Growing up knowing that they're same-sex attracted and being told by their own people that you're a second-class citizen can't be healthy. And the Irish thing is interesting because people say, well, Ireland has beat us. They're way more progressive than us. And I see people tweeting things like, I'm so embarrassed about being Australian. And I'm thinking, well, it's a bit silly. I mean, we're actually very progressive. I'm a sociologist of relationships, and whenever I go to sociology conferences abroad, people always say how great Australia is because we have de facto relationships, which is a foreign concept to so many people, particularly the Americans, who really, when you explain it to them, they look quite amazed that you can have so many rights without actually formalising the relationship.
One of the things that's been in the news lately has been Ben Jago in Tasmania, and it's been used as an argument for marriage equality. How do you feel about that?
I've had it explained to me about why it's an argument for marriage equality, but I don't actually see it that way at all. I think, if anything, it's a perfect example of why we need to do those things like educating police. I recently met with police in my own community, and their police are the first responders who go out to domestic violence, and they had no knowledge of the laws that protected same-sex partners. And I found that quite incredible after all these years. But I don't think marriage equality would change that, because if they went to that house then and the person wasn't married because they may not want to, or they just haven't got around to it or something, they would still probably think that relationship wasn't legal. So I think in that sense, that example shows that we need to do much more education. We also need to, I hate the term capacity building, I think we need to do capacity building amongst our own community to make people like that young guy actually feel like they can then challenge it immediately and they know where to go and who to turn to for help. Because perhaps if it was addressed very early on, that may not have happened the way it did.
How do you feel about the plebiscite?
Yeah, look, again, a bit mixed. I really didn't like the idea to start with. It's funny because in 2004, I remember people asking about that. And of course, there was no way in 2004 we would ever win a plebiscite, and it would have been disastrous. And of course, we were very much against it. I also understand people saying that it's going to be very negative and there'll be awful campaigns. There will be. It'll be awful. And it'd be awful to hear that young people are growing up hearing that. But as I said before, they're already growing up being told by Facebook that they're second-class citizens, which, as I said, I don't like. But so anyway, if a plebiscite can finish that and let us move on, maybe it'll be a good thing. And potentially it's something that will allow the community to have that sort of cathartic response of going, yeah, okay, we've dealt with it now, it's done. And it might make the law eventually stronger. I mean, there have been countries like Canada when the Conservatives won government not long after marriage equality came in, where they originally said they're going to remove it. Well, I think once a plebiscite happens, no one's going to jump up and say they're going to remove marriage equality. But I understand all the problems with it, and I wish there was a better way for it, because I don't think it's fair that we should vote for necessarily for rights like that.
What do you think the timeline is for marriage equality?
I don't think it's that far away.
Is it inevitable?
Oh yes, definitely inevitable. I mean, look, the history of marriage has shown that it's changed radically over time, and as the historian Stephanie Coons says, that heterosexuals have changed marriage way more than anyone else, and actually, if anything, our change is very minute. And I think in 2004, I don't know about the others on the committee, but I really didn't think we'd even be this far today. I remember when we got married in '05, thinking it would be, at the end of my life sometime where it would be recognised. So I think we've come a long way in 10 years, and that's thanks to people like Alex Greenwich and Rodney Croom, who really built that movement after we got the internal community on side. Then they're able to build and make it as big as it is today.
A couple more questions. Are you still involved with the Australian Marriage Equality campaign?
No, I'm not really. I wanted to for a while, but again, as I said, I guess I probably personally feel a bit funny about some of the way it's been advertised, as I've said, and so I guess I sort of pulled back a bit from the marriage debate, and I'm sort of focusing on much other issues. I'm also doing my PhD, so I probably don't have any time anyway.
What advice would you give to the existing campaigns? How can they improve?
Yeah, I think the campaigns need to sort of move away from the promotion of, say, that marriage equality will produce better relationships and longer relationships. Marriage equality won't change that. If the idea that marriage equality is going to make more stable long-term relationships, then we could probably argue that it's because people are too scared to get divorced, and so they're staying together, which we still see amongst heterosexual couples who get married and then it's so difficult to unmesh. So perhaps it will do that, but I think we need to have a better discussion around these things.
What are your hopes for the future with regard to marriage equality?
I kind of, at this stage, after 11 years, just wish it would happen, which I think everyone does. But I hope it comes in soon. But I hope we can also, personally, I think as a community, we can then use that to actually, controversially, but to change marriage. In that I think once the same-sex couples start marrying, I think we'll have a very different way of dealing with attitudes like divorce. Eventually, it'll take time, but I think we might actually end up changing the wider community's attitudes towards marriage and divorce and family.
And finally, what advice would you have to anybody that wants to get involved with the campaign?
Yeah, I would say get involved now. It's an exciting time too. We're just around the corner from legalising it, so it'd be perfect to get involved. But do what you can. If being a collectivist, as they say, is all you can do, great, that's fine. If going to rallies is your thing, do that. But I guess the most important thing is to have those conversations, and the whole idea that the person is political is very true in this case. Go out there and meet with politicians, even if you're single. Don't think that you have to be, like we hear, an engaged couple, and don't feel like you have to rush out and get engaged, but go meet with the politician, even as a single person, and say why you want marriage equality. And they usually listen. They want to hear these views.
Luke Gahan, thank you very much.
Thank you.